Long, long ago, in the age of centralization, the land of Nchi suffered quietly under the yoke of a tyrannical central government. The far-flung provinces of Kule and Zamunda gave their taxes and dues, collected without fail. They were promised development, infrastructure. They waited and waited and waited, but nothing ever came. Meanwhile, in the capital city, the central government was busy developing the city, overdeveloped it, threw wild parties, and soon they ran out of money. It was time to collect again. It was not sustainable. One day, a child dared remind the king about a promise he had made. It was a mistake. And the people in the provinces realized that their suggestions were not welcome, but their money was. People from Kule and Zamunda and soon even Hapa marched to the capital to demand a better method, and the government had no choice. Devolution had come to Nchi. A great forum was called. In every little village hall and church lawn, people met finally to discuss what was at the heart of the matter. How national resources were shared. How much were the provinces of Hapa, Kule, and Zamunda going to get under the devolved system? But it was not as easy a decision as they thought.
When we set out to do this, I think one of the main goals that we wanted to bring out is that people can actually discuss a lot of these things that we think is can only be done by budget experts and economists. Because local people in different areas across the country understand the place where they live. They have a real understanding of the kind of services they need and the kind of services that they currently have.
So we looked at data from the health sector, we looked at data from the agriculture sector, we looked at information on the revenues that counties actually collect from property taxes and from other sources of own revenue, and we tried to put that together and manipulated it a bit so that it wasn't recognizably any county, but that it was similar to what some counties actually, the conditions in certain counties. And then we asked people to think about how they would share those resources. And so for that purpose, we took them through the current formula and made sure that they understood very clearly how the decisions were made in the current formula to share resources. Then with that background, we asked them, okay, now you're in the driver's seat. Here's the 10 billion shillings. Here are the 3 counties, Hapa, Kule, and Zamunda. How do you want to share these resources in a way that you can justify it?
Tumeambiwa tuipeleke kwa county. County tatu. Na sioni kama sisi ndo tutakaowagawanyia ile pesa wao vile watakavyoitumia. Tutawagawanyia ile ratio wanaweza kutumia county hii kama ni 3M point what hivyo.
We have this we've gone through this formula. Tumeona vile wamekuwa wakidivide now. Na do we like this?
No.
Hizi mifano tumepewa, nadhani ndio tutaangalia. Kwa hizi county tatu tuangalie hizi mifano ndio tugawanye pesa kulingana na hizi mifano. Kama hawangetaka tufuate mifano, wangetuambia milioni 10 hiyo kagawanyeni kwa kaunti tatu.
Do we like this?
No.
We do not like this.
Huu ni mfano tumepewa na tuende na mfano. Sasa tukienda tukiacha hizi mifano, tutaweka wapi hiyo pesa?
You know, I think what happened as we watched people have this go through this exercise is that the first thing that happened in most places is that people were confused and very challenged by this data, not sure what to do with this data, not entirely comfortable with the data. Generally, when you tell people that they're going to be doing something that involves numbers and involves math, they get a little bit frightened. They're not really sure what to do, and I think that happened almost everywhere.
If this was a gift, then that would be fair. Because you say whoever is giving the gift has distributed it equally.
Kwa nini tumekubaliana tuwape sawa?
Watoto wetu wote. Yes.
Na kuna matatizo
yes.
ya kiafya.
Yes.
Ili mtoto
So you want us to go by number of health facilities or incidence of disease
I would like us to go with
in the
the
population?
consideration of the need.
Well, I think it was interesting first to see the surprise on people when they realized that they could actually make sense of numbers. And thinking about the data that we had put together and how people interpreted it was also quite interesting.
We shouldn't give population a higher mark because looking at Kule, which has the highest percentage, the number of health facilities in Kule is 162. So if we give them money, and they start building other health facilities, while Zamunda has the lowest population and number of facilities ni kidogo, yet they have the number of TB incidences, malaria incidences is the highest. Looking at giving population a higher amount, I'm not for that.
Two of the parameters that were quite surprising for people was the parameter that is used for population and of course the parameter of poverty, because how those parameters are measured was very different from how people thought those two work. For example, when thinking about population is that it's based on the ratio, that what is the share of the population of one county in relation to the whole population in the country.
Honestly, I can assure you that I'm not reading so much of this. I am thoroughly lost.
Me, I'm lost. Let me just say, because I have a feeling we are lost.
In most cases, people quickly started recognizing in this data something that was relevant to them, something that they could understand, often starting with the health data, which was the first data on the sheet. And I think that then from there, people started moving into discussions about how do we interpret this data? And they quickly looked at how to group the data in ways to make it easier to use and how to relate it back to the three principles of need, capacity, and effort. So there are three basic principles that we think should inform revenue sharing and that I think generally have been used around the world to inform revenue sharing formulas. The first is needs, and basically the principle is that those who need more should get more. Those who have greater health needs or a greater need for different kinds of services should get more. The second is capacity, and by capacity we mean that those who have more resources should contribute more to their own services. Basically, this is the idea that a family that's rich should be able to make more of a contribution to its own services than a family that's poor. When we think about effort, the final principle, basically what we mean is that those who make more of an effort to raise their own resources or to use their resources properly or to use their resources for their own benefit should be rewarded. They shouldn't be punished. So we don't want to take away from people who are making an effort to provide services for themselves. So those three principles together, although they pull in different directions, help us to understand what's fair when we share resources. I think wherever we went around the country, the first thing that people were able to identify was the importance of needs. Almost in every forum, in every discussion, people quickly went to the idea that people that have different needs should be treated differently. They shouldn't be given the same amounts, the same amount of resources. People who need more should get more. I think that principle was the easiest for people to understand, and they came to it without us even having to prompt them.
Okay, let's start a very simple thing. More than the fact. Health. Who is the worst? So that is not ranking.
My friends and gentlemen, ladies, we found a marginalized society, a society that is dying, a society with a crisis. They had serious health issues. HIV was rampant, malaria was rampant. They had no infrastructure despite their huge numbers. They had no food, and they had no business.
The paved roads in Zamunda is 1 kilometer. Yet in Kule, that has the highest population, is 15 kilometers.
This is almost half of the population who are taken to hospital due to malaria. Almost the entire population are sick.
It's an epidemic.
Population in itself cannot help. It is the need of that population.
If we improve the health of these people, right, then they'll be able to take part into these other components of development. Therefore, we say let's allocate more money there.
A lot of people were trying to relate, the information they had, for example, in health, to what it meant to the different population that they could see across the counties.
For example, there was a lot of discussion about, do we put more emphasis on population as a general measure of the need for services, or do we put more emphasis on the neediness of the population, the actual needs that they have that we can see here? People are sick, or they lack roads, or they lack clinics.
So if you continue on looking at population, then you are going to discourage people from going out there and developing the counties. So the population variable should be interrogated with the view of removing it. If you look at Kule could have 162 now health facilities, and though the population of the now the incidences are high, so you will realize that Kule will require the services, the provision of services and not the construction of the new facilities. So that being the case, you will find that Zamunda will require more allocation than Kule, despite the high incidences, because construction and equipping will be higher than the provision of the services.
They have challenges with disease, of course, malaria, TB, but population-wise, they have the smallest population.
And therefore, you have to kind of look at it carefully and see, well, this county, Zamunda, is actually sicker and poorer in different ways, but the number of people that live there that need services is much lower than the number of sick and poor people in Kule, even though Kule is on balance not as sick. But because that population is so large, the number of people that need services is much higher. So we kind of gave that to people, and I think people had a challenge in figuring that out, but they also confronted it, and a number of people, I think, started to understand this was the same issue when we compared Isiolo and Turkana.
Kwa nini Turkana ambaye ni similar, mambo ya Turkana na Isiolo County ni similar, mambo ya Marsabit ni similar, mambo ya Mandera kule ni similar. Ni kwa nini wanapatiwa billions and billions na tuko katika mazingara moja? We are all pastoralists. Ni kwa nini wanapatiwa more allocation than us?
Well, I think the most interesting one was one we had in Isiolo, where there was a big argument as to why counties that were as poor as Isiolo seem to be getting a lot more billions than Isiolo was getting. And the argument that was made, which was very rational if you ask me, was why are we as poor as they are and we are not getting as much as they are getting? A lot of people thought it's based on the poverty index across the counties, but in the real sense it's based on the actual number of poor people that live in a certain county as a share of all the poor people that live in the whole country. So people understanding this, you could see the surprise, but at the same time you could see a lot of the light bulbs going on, and people could now understand how some of these parameters work.
Kwa ufupi, hapa inaonyesha ya kwamba Zamunda liko na mahitaji zaidi, kwa sababu unaona wale wanatumia hiyo hospitali ni 64%.
And again, if poverty index in our world is not the same, it is not fair to give them equal share. And finally also, if the vastness of the area differs, then they give us their awards which are more vast or expansive than others, then it's not fair to give them equal share.
The other principles were more challenging. I think that people have a difficult time discriminating between capacity and effort, and part of that is related to the language that we use, because we use capacity in a lot of different ways.
I feel it's a challenge to separate capacity and effort, because sometimes we cannot do anything about natural cause. Sometimes people we are in Taita Taveta. We have been bestowed with a lot of minerals, a lot of water bodies, Chala, Mzima Spring. Cannot do it. We have nothing to do about it. You cannot transform Mzima Spring to Makueni County.
62% of Taita Taveta is the national park. Land is the primary factor of production. So if a county does not have 62% of its land primary resource for production, then there should be another factor that will compensate.
So when you talk of capacity, and I don't have ile nafasi
ya ku-exercise my capacity inakuwa shida. So there are some injustices lazima ziwe rectified kwanza ndio tuje kwa hiyo hali ya capacity na effort.
Pesa saa hii ikiletwa hapa ndio tugawanyane na Wameru. Na Wameru wakipata hii pesa wanafikiria kufanyia nini? Wameru wamepiga lami, Wameru wamejenga university, Wameru wamejenga college, kila kitu wamejenga wamemaliza. Isiolo leo tuna shida ya nursery. Nyumba ya nursery na walimu wa nursery.
How can you bring my capacity to your level so that we can be able to manage the resources? Because at the end of the day, we don't want to waste the resources. Otherwise, they will not be regenerative. They will be in a diminishing return.
People often talk about capacity as ability. But I think the way that we think about capacity when we're talking about resource sharing is about the resources that we're able to generate on our own. How much do we have? What is our endowment? And that is what we call fiscal capacity. And it's a different concept from the way capacity is often used when we talk about building people's capacity in trainings or whatever. It's often overlaps with people's understanding of effort, which is, of course, how much is more about the choices that people make, whereas capacity is not always something that you can choose. You may have an endowment of natural resources in your county. You didn't choose to have that. You're just lucky to have that. But the way that you use the resources that you get is a measure of your effort.
For us, we looked at capacity to absorb the amounts that have been given over a period of time. So if you don't have the capacity to absorb that, then it is not important to be that an equal amount of money in somebody else who has that absorption capacity. Then the other thing is the actual needs, the need-based issues. We also look at that. And then the issue of prioritization at that particular time also will be very important. We can even decide to give it to one person everything if actually he really deserves to have everything.
Looking at HAPA, it's generated, or it has the ability to generate more revenue than the others, simply because because own revenue, that is through single business permits and property rates.
If you look at Kule in agriculture, like 69% are able to do farming, but when it comes to the county itself, trying to raise revenue. I mean, the agriculture thing tells you that they have the capacity. Most of the population are well. They can raise, they can pay their fees and something like that.
You know, you have to uplift wale ambao wanajenerate ndogo, but through capacity building their capacity in making
so in
them
your
more.
thinking, the way you're thinking, this county, we should, if we are allocating money just basically on that thinking alone, give more to those with less capacity.
Yes, not to, for them to wajijenge. Yes.
What do we think about that?
That you may need 20 shillings. Well, it is very sad to be given 20 shillings, but you can only manage 5 shillings. So we cannot give you 20 shillings, honestly.
If you have the capacity to raise, we encourage you to use your resources and give you less.
Yeah, we give you less.
So they're supposed to be given less.
Yeah, it's supposed to be given less.
Yes. You have to increase production and also create the possibility of getting to the market so that at the end of the day, you have now a higher multiplier effect.
If you make an effort to raise a lot of revenue, you'll have a lot of revenue. And then it looks like you have a lot of capacity. So they start to overlap. But I think we want to be able to distinguish that in certain conditions, for example, a county that's very poor can still make a great effort to raise more revenue. Even when they make a great effort to raise revenue, they're still going to have less than another county that happens to have a lot of economic activity or a lot of natural resources. And therefore, that county has a higher capacity, even though this county is making more of an effort. They're two different concepts.
Samunda looks oppressed, even in farming.
People are still poor. Why? It could be because there's a group of minority group who owns those
welfare
buildings that you are seeing in Nairobi. While a bigger chunk of people in Nairobi, and he confirmed to me that the highest number of population that is living in Kibera are living in squalor, as compared to those who are staying in Runda.
They are down. So even if
can we know why?
Why? It's here.
So that is what you're saying.
Look
Those
at,
with little capacity to produce or generate revenue should be
Be
given
given
more.
more, yeah.
Yeah. So that one we've already said that.
Those counties became potential because other counties were paying marginal price. So I don't see the reason why we should reward. Like we are giving you more because you're generating more. You're generating more because my county was suffering by the time you were developing. And you need to bring me up to that level so that we think about now, can we share equally?
So it means in essence that those with greater capacity now should get less, so that those with less capacity can get more for there to strike a balance to kind of take affirmative action kind of.
Okay. This distinction between capacity and effort, the confusion was that people would say, well, in certain parts of the country, people are more capable of doing things for themselves. And that overlaps with an idea about productivity, that areas that are more productive should receive more. And I think, we had a lot of conversations about were we talking about something that goes back to sessional paper number 10, where we say that those parts of the country where if you invest more, you'll get more, are those the parts of the country where we should put more? Because on balance, the whole country will benefit. But of course, one of the reasons why we've shifted from the old way of doing things to the new way of doing things is that what we saw before is that we did put resources in certain parts of the country, but everybody didn't benefit. And so I think one of the things that we're thinking today when we think about fairness is that we want to make sure that everybody is going to have a chance to benefit. So figuring out how we do that in a fair way, I think, was something that there was a lot of debate about.
And I would have a social equality or /need, which would include education, health, agriculture, and urban indexes.
89% of the households in Kule are actually doing the crop farming. Yeah. So at least each house in Kule, at least 89% of the households. Because if you say they have more population and they're actually engaging in economic activities, they have the effort.
And if you only look at crop share farming, but you don't ask yourself what are other people doing in this county, then you're not really going to get a picture of the revenue capacity of the county. So in that sense, it didn't quite, it's not as good of a measure of that as it is of what we had intended, of the need for services in the agriculture sector. But I think the thought process that people were going through as they were coming up with that idea was not a bad way for them to start. If we give them more information and help them to understand, then I think eventually they'll come to see that maybe it's not the best measure of capacity, but it is related to capacity.
Like you look at the effort, you bring in more, you get more.
We should reward them based on their work.
Kule does not bring more. Hapa brings even more than Kule. Look at the single business, permits, property rates.
Hapa and Kule, like change in per capita collection, yeah, they are negative.
They were able to collect 900 million. Now they think they are going to be collecting 400 million. Is that what we should reward?
But Samuda is doing fine, is maintaining, it's not negative.
So who are we giving the motisha to? The people who are actually doing the work, or the people who should be doing the work and are not really doing the work?
Zamuda has more effort.
Na wale tutawazika hivyo kwa vile hawana kina Taita. That's what Taita wako nyuma. Wao hawataangalia tunapeana watu wenye effort pekee.
We had a scenario where there were some two wards that had a drop in the amount of revenue they raised over 2 years, and we had one that the revenue actually went up. But then when people came to deciding how to share money for effort, is a lot of the groups actually gave money to the ward that had collected less or had not done well in terms of the revenue, because they thought there's something that is wrong in those counties that we need to improve so they can do much better. In our interpretation, we thought that people will be rewarding those who are working harder to raise more, and those who are not working so hard will actually get what I can call, quotes in quotes, punished, and they will get a bit less.
The reason that that people usually use this kind of measure as a measure of what's called tax effort is because it tries to cancel out the total amount of resources that we have access to, which is really a measure of capacity, by focusing on the change. By focusing on the difference, it's in the difference that you can see that effort that's being made or the choices that are being made.
The ones who are doing more, they'll be supported.
Yes.
The ones who are going down, they'll be
uplifted. No.
Counties that
uplifted.
Counties that have loopholes
We uplift them.
in their revenue collection should not be rewarded
Because they cannot, that's where now we miss what we call equality.
When
it cannot be found there.
Kuna counties zingine zinaonekana hazina effort, lakini ukichunguza sana utakuta kwamba hawana nafasi hata ya exercise that effort.
I think it's important for people to understand that the data we were giving people with respect to effort was how much revenue was the county able to collect from key sources, property rates and business permits, a couple years ago, and how much are they able to collect today. And the difference between what they were able to collect before and what they're able to collect today takes out kind of the overall level of development of that place and focuses more on the change, right? So a place that is able to collect more because it just has a lot of economic activity going on, a very rich county, they're going to have a high level of collection in both years. But whether that collection is going up, whether it's going down, by how much it's going up, that's the measure of effort. We had been doing trainings for a long time and talking to people about revenue sharing, but we knew that people don't really understand something until they have to do it themselves. And so we wanted to create an exercise where people actually had to make the decision. If you're given this money, what do you do with it? How will you distribute it in a way that you can justify to yourself and to a group of people that you're working with? So we wanted to come up with an exercise that was as close as possible to the actual decision that's made by CRA when they come up with a revenue allocation formula.
Well, one comment that cut right across all the counties that we went to is that every time we finished with the exercise, people will say, finally we recognize that the work that CRA is doing is not easy. And the numbers really, I think, surprised them. And if you look at the data that we had put, there was really small compared to what you would have in a real scenario where you're using data to make a decision across 47 counties. And even if it's at the ward level, when you are looking at some counties like Bungoma that have over 40 wards. So people, of course, were shocked by the numbers, but at the same time, what we wanted them to really know is that it's not so much about adding up and calculating numbers, but it's finding meaning in the number and using that to decide what is fair when you're sharing revenue among, different regions, whether it's wards, whether it's counties. And so, while the data was a shock at the beginning, but at the end of it, people appreciated the importance of using data to understand the context of the different regions.
But in a number of groups, they were able, I think, to identify something in the data that they wanted to use that was not in the current formula. And I think that on some level, that's what we really hope to see, that people would start to question why we don't have certain things in the formula that are actually relevant. It's revealing that actually across all the data, that's an example, but across all the data, people's interpretation of the same data is different. And that I think the implication of that is that we have to explain to people very clearly why we are putting certain data into the formula so that they understand what the rationale is. And I think that's not the case currently. Most people do not understand why certain variables are in the formula. That severely undermines the legitimacy of the formula because people will not find something legitimate that they don't understand. And their interpretation may be very different.
I think to some level we can get to a level where we will have a debate that is more sensible than what we've been having. Because when you think about discussing how we share revenue, the first goal is that we want to get as accurate a formula as possible in terms of, are we giving enough money to everyone to run services? Are we giving enough money to redistribute, to take care of areas that have been marginalized? But then the second goal also of discussing division of revenue or how we share revenue is also to get a legitimacy that people can say, we've seen this formula, we've discussed it, and we think we agree with the things that we say in it.
So in that sense, the exercise worked quite well. I think in terms of people coming to a resolution, that was much more challenging. And some groups didn't come to resolutions, or they came to resolutions in the last few seconds of the exercise. But I think in terms of understanding the principle, what we're discussing, why we're discussing these things, I think the exercise was successful.
I think we looked at the incomes And we also look at the amount of money, like the single permits and also the population.
In all this, as we were going, we were trying to identify all of them. We were trying to see which one was effort, which one was need, which one was capacity. We were trying to determine which ones we could cluster into those three groups.
We realized that Z has a health crisis, but the others had less issues. Okay. But in totality, because we did not go into complicated formulas, that's why we just decided to allocate the amounts that we did. Okay.
And we used a ranking, a matrix of the needs, capacities and effort assessment, where we are scoring points, where we give the one with the greatest need, or the greatest justification, we'll give it a 3 out of, I mean, from 1 to 3 in order, I'll give it a 3, showing the highest degree of justification, and a 1 for less justification.
We ranked Kule number 1, Zamunda number 2, and then Hapa number 3. And then we did that in all the tables, and then we classified the needs according to the rankings that we have given them per table.
So I didn't go so much into the details, but just going by the health issues, it was enough to tell us, based on this, we don't even need to change these figures because the others will compensate for each other. So we decided that right there and then to give them 4.5 billion, and for Y, because of their less problems, we give them 3 billion, and for X, we give them 2.5 billion.
X, 2.6 billion, Y, 3 billion, and Z, 4.4 billion. That's the exact figure that we got.
30 million to Hapa and 30 million to Zabuda to the third one to distribute bado.
I think kulingana na hii yetu just vile tulisema kwamba mahitaji imeonekana kwamba Zamuda ndio nao, lakini ukiona kwa ile kugawa pesa, wale walipata pesa mingi ni kule kwa sababu sasa ya population. Ile population yao iko kubwa, hata umaskini yao ilikuwa lakini ndio hata pesa tukawapatia nyingi.
Therefore, overall, sharing the 10 billion, Zamuda get more, followed by Kule, then Hapa. We were unable to come up with figures because of all the time we were given. We are working through the figures and analyzing the situation of each county.
I think we had about 4 groups even at that, and it was always a mixed picture. And the reason why I say it's a mixed picture is because for some of the groups, they gave more money to certain functions. For example, they gave more money to health. And so counties that had a higher disease burden ended up getting more money. In some cases, some groups divided the money equally among the 3 wards or the 3 counties, and then they will try and say, okay, this county is not doing so well, let's give them a bit of the 400 million from this side. So the approach was quite different in terms of how people interpreted the data and how eventually they actually went about sharing the revenue. All the groups had backup explanations as to why they gave different amounts to different counties.
Coming into this, people didn't really realize that this process was going on, that they were meant to participate, and that they really hadn't had an opportunity to do so. So I think one of the things that was nice about this, this whole exercise, beyond the final part of it where people actually get to make the decisions, is that in many places, for the first time, people understood the current formula, which we've been operating for the last couple of years, but nobody had ever bothered to explain to them how it works that way, why certain variables were included.
Every time people understood how the current formula worked, a lot of that pulling towards your side kind of died down. It's not so much about adding up and calculating numbers, but it's finding meaning in the number and using that to decide what is fair when you're sharing revenue among, different regions, whether it's wards, whether it's counties. And so, while the data was a shock at the beginning, but at the end of it, people appreciated the importance of using data to understand the context of the different regions.
When we are giving or sharing the revenue among the wards in our county, this is an example, then we're supposed to put into consideration population size of the wards in each ward, we're supposed to put into consideration poverty in the parameters or index in each of the wards, and also vastness of the wards. And actually that's what should apply, and that's what applies nationally.
It's long overdue, not necessarily even after the devolution, but it should have been done even before the other government. People should be aware to know what is their budget, what they need. After all, they're the taxpayers. They should know how to spend their money, and they should be told this is how it's been used. And also to give their priorities as to how money should be used in the counties or in the entire government.
The Constitution of 2010 and County Government Act talks so much about public participation, but in real sense, live about citizens, even duty bearers, most of them are ignorant about what is contained in the Constitution and what is contained in this act.
Kweli ni kwamba watu hawajui, wale wanajua ni hawa wachache wako hapa kwenye county, lakini kule chini nyanjani watu hawajui budget, hawaelewi inaenda namna gani, hawajui ni nini wametengewa kina mama ama watoto ama youth ama disability, hawaelewi. Kwa hivyo hata tumeshukuru kwa ajili ya hii event. Tukitoka hapa tuhakikishe kila mwananchi amejua hii budget imemfikia namna gani, imemhusu, je, aelimishwe vile anaweza kwenda na kutafuta haki yake katika hii budget.
We need to now go back to the community to enlighten them more on maybe budget tracking.
The approach was quite different in terms of how people interpreted the data and how eventually they actually went about sharing the revenue. So I can't tell you which county got more and which county got less. All I can tell you is that people had reasons as to why they gave money to what ward or to what county, which is the main goal of this, is that we should always have reasons as to why we are making certain decisions.
This formula was not developed only to serve the interests of certain people, but we were trying to create a formula. We may not have succeeded, but we were trying to create a formula that was fair, that would give people resources based on what they need. And that as we revise that formula, that we can make it more fair, but that it isn't just about what I'm going to get from this formula, and that people are capable of having that conversation, that we're not restricted to a democracy in which we're just constantly talking about what's in it for me, what I can get out of it, but we're also talking about what's good for the country, what makes the most sense, what's fair, what would a person who's not trying to just get as much as they can out of this, but wants to do the best for the country, what would they do? We can actually have that conversation, and I think that we don't have enough of those conversations, not just about the formula, but if you think about county budgets or national budgets, the conversation is always about what am I going to get from this? How much is my sector going to get? How much is my ward going to get? How much is my village going to get? That conversation is okay. We're going to ask those questions. We want to know what we're going to get as individuals. There's nothing wrong with that, but it can't be the only conversation. We also need to have a conversation about what's good for the country.
It's very possible to have this kind of discussion even at the national level, and also even when we're discussing the budgets at the county level on what to share between the different wards. It's very possible to have this same kind of discussion, but we need to make sure that people have the information and we explain the decision as to why we are using or giving them certain information to discuss. So it's very possible to do.
Well, not everything is perfect yet. The new model has provisions for you, as an ordinary wananchi, to actually make your views known to the Commission of Revenue Allocation and affect how resources are distributed. The real question is, what are you, as a citizen, doing about it? Your country needs you.
The fate of nchi yetu was at stake. No longer will the people of nchi yetu sit back and allow the central government to make all the decisions for them. They would exercise their rights fully from that day and make sure that their concerns were noted by their leaders. A new tide was turning in nchi yetu. What will come of it?